So I want to start by saying it's a real honor to be here, and especially to be following kind of the three other presenters. I think you guys are getting a very diverse crop of what the life of an alumni could look like. And so what I'm going to blast through a bunch of stuff, and I really am looking forward to a question and answer period at the end. So please, any question, doesn't matter, doesn't have to be politically correct, feel free to ask them. My goal is just to share a few learnings, things I've learned along the way from my professional journey, tell a few stories. I'm going to give you a little micro lecture on the importance of reinventing the toilet. So you're going to learn something here, hopefully. And then, like I said, focus on answering your questions. I've been over 30 years out of college, and I have had 2 full-time paying jobs, and they're both actually working for Bill Gates in one form or another. So that's a very weird profile right there. All of you, I'm sure, are going to have more different jobs out of in your 30 years after graduating. But I want to kind of I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these kind of phases of my life, and some things that I learned, and some things that frankly happened, and then 15 years later impact my professional life in ways that I never might have imagined. I'll give you just an example. I went to Microsoft, and my wife and I had traveled a little bit independently. When we started dating, we said, it'd be great to quit our jobs, backpack around the world, for a year. At that point, I was like a year and a half into Microsoft. I thought, yeah, before I turn 30, let's quit our jobs and see the world. I did that. That's that gap between 93 and 94. We spent all of our time in Latin America and Southeast Asia and in India, so developing countries, and a lot of time thinking about what does it take for countries to kind of pull themselves out of poverty. And lo and behold, that was an interest my whole time in Microsoft, interest from a philanthropic perspective. Lo and behold, through a bizarre series of events, I now get to work at the Gates Foundation working on just that. It's kind of remarkable how things eventually come around. So, phase 1, University of Waterloo. It's interesting. So back in '86, just to give you a sense, like I was a math guy. I like physics. I like chemistry. I'd never touched a computer when I came to the University of Waterloo. I thought I should apply for applied math. I now know why. I knew enough about myself from Dora's perspective to know, and then from your perspective, I knew that like being 99% stuck 99% of the time wasn't really kind of where I was at. So I liked math. I thought, should I go into pure math? I said, I think applied math is more me. I didn't start in co-op, and then I took. I think we all had to take a class in programming. Fortran. Has anybody here, any of the student that knows how to program in Fortran? There we go. Well, and the second term I did COBOL. Anybody programmed in COBOL? Another, yeah. All the folks that are closer to my cohort. So there weren't, by any stretch, the most elegant programming languages, but I loved the opportunity to solve problems and the creativity that was involved in programming. And it's interesting, I've always loved that. And so I shifted into computer science after my 1B term. And then, interestingly, and so my father, when I applied, my father was a mechanical engineer. And when I applied for math, he says, is you're going to be an engineer? And I'm like, no, Dad, there's actually a faculty of mathematics at Waterloo, which he thought was bizarre, because it was. And then when I said applied math, he says, so that's kind of like engineering? I'm like, well, maybe. And then when I went into computer science, he says, is that in the School of Engineering? I said, no, that's still in mathematics. But then if you saw, I did this weird program, which was computer science with electrical engineering electives. That really threw him for a loop. Now you're going to be an engineer. Are you going to get an iron ring? And I said, no, Dad, I'm not going to get an iron ring. So he thought probably his shiftless son would never make it in the world. But because people didn't really know about the power of software back in '86. When I was here, I lived 4 terms in dorms and 4 terms in Sunnydale, which we referred to as basically the student ghetto. I imagine you still have one, though I understand it's no longer Sunnydale. I learned a lot of important lessons in that time. I was a Don in my 2B term, so summer term. I was a Don, so I got free room and board. But I also had the responsibility for trying to help bring people out of their dorm rooms and not spend all their time studying. And I had decided that I was not going to kind of live just a study life, and I was having a lot of fun. And that was actually the year that Fed Hall opened. And it was also the year that MTV launched and music videos became this thing. So for all of you students, you're like, what? So that was a big deal back then. And I remember that summer term, probably 4 nights a week, I would at least be at last call at Fed Hall, dancing and hanging out with friends. And I tried to kind of model that for my students. So, and this is something that basically will be something you will have to manage for the rest of your lives. If you're a go-getter and if you aspire to deliver high impact in whatever you do in the world, you will be very tempted to make that thing your be-all, end-all. And as Patrick said this morning, I think that that's actually a totally viable and even exciting and healthy in spurts. And I think it's really, really, really hard to be a happy person if you're doing that all the time. So I'd say now's a good time for you to start to define what your boundaries are and make sure that the things that are most important to you other than doing well at school, you're making time for. And it's totally possible. And I challenge your professors in the room to kind of help make that more possible for you. One question, Oktoberfest it was a big deal when I was here. I imagine it's still a big deal here. But you guys are a year younger than we were, and so kind of less legal for drinking. Our professors, the only time they really took it easy on us was during that week. Hopefully that still happens here. I don't know. What Patrick said, and frankly, any of you in co-op, a lot of times people think it's great to build up your resume, but of course, what I found fantastic is even more learning what you like, learning what you don't like. And I would encourage you to experiment. It is really, really great to be able to have 4-month stints to experiment. And sometimes people feel, well, if I stay with the same company over and over again, I'll be more likely to get that job at the end. I think if you do well in your 4 months and then you do a good job of networking and staying in touch, you will still be able to get that job offer. But I'd strongly encourage you to shake it up. I did a couple terms with IBM in Toronto, a couple terms with Philips in Montreal, very different, and then a last term with a small company, Geovision in Ottawa. And it was interesting, and I had a job offer, and so at the end, I basically was in good shape because I was only interviewing that last time for companies that I thought might potentially offer something that would be even better than the thing I already knew. And one of the interesting things was, by that time I'd probably, I'd written my resume, updated it every 8 months, as you guys probably all have to. I'd probably done 30 interviews. And I sat down for this interview with this little company I didn't really know much about. That was Microsoft. And what was amazing is I'd had 30 interviews under my belt. Nobody had ever asked me in an interview to solve a problem. Nobody had ever asked me to write code. That is probably not the case for any of you or anybody that's basically been going through co-op interviews for the last 20 years, 25 years. In my interview with Microsoft, there was this guy, sometimes called the Mad Hungarian, Charles Simoni. Has anybody ever heard of Hungarian notation? Okay, that's from Charles. And so he was interviewing me and immediately asked me to code a problem. I think it was insert into a linked list or something. And I thought I was expert at interviews. This had never happened, but no problem, I did it. And then he said, Brian, you understand base 2? I'm like, binary? Yeah, I understand that. He says, tell me, can you represent every number in base -2? I'm like, what? Base -2? Every number, yes or no? I'm like, so I thought about it, and I'm a little stressed out. I said, yes, I think you can. He says, write me program, add 2 base -2 numbers. And I had to do it right there in the interview. That was so far away from the experience of anybody I'd ever met who had ever had an interview. It was just completely new. Now, those kinds of things happen all the time. In other words, anybody who's a tech, interviewing for tech jobs knows that they should expect to have to maybe do some coding in an interview, that they should expect to be given a question, a problem space that is designed to see how do you respond to a challenge you've never faced before, you've never thought about before. But back then it was completely bizarre and unique, but I thought thrilling. like the idea of working for that company, as opposed to all the other ones, seemed very interesting to me. There's something going on. I wanted to understand what it was. And so I got invited out for a day of interviews and went to Microsoft in Seattle, for a couple of years. Because I thought, I'd learned some things there. It'd be cool to be on the West Coast and then to come back and do whatever was next. I never came back. That was 1986, and I wound up spending 22 years at Microsoft. Now I arrived, and I think it was Dora that mentioned that, or Patrick, that it's easy to call yourself an engineer in the U.S. It's not the same as Canada. So like I got to work, and when I finally got my business cards, it said software design engineer. And as you can imagine, I thought, oh, my dad, who's been hassling me about not being an engineer for years. So I just kind of circled it, put it in an envelope, no other commentary, and sent it home. So that was fun. I started Microsoft, and I'd never touched a PC because that's not what we were using back here. I actually, back in the day, I remember having projects that I did have to use punch cards for. So I am that old. We had systems that were state-of-the-art here, but I just hadn't ever worked on a PC, but was able to get a job at Microsoft, luckily, and learned a lot about it. I was also lucky enough to join a company that was starting a crazy growth spurt. So I know there's some conversations around, would you rather be in a small company, a big company? I was lucky to be in, it was about 1,000 people when I started. A year later, it was about 2,000 people. So it was insane growth. And when I left, it was 95,000 people. Growth equals opportunity. If you're in a place where so we were obviously recruiting like crazy, spent a lot of time on that, but we were also, there was so much we needed to get done. And what that meant was that there was opportunity. So I was the junior programmer on Access, but because we staffed up that team, I eventually wound up in that first project. It took a long time, 5.5 years. We made a lot of dumb mistakes along the way. We didn't have anybody who owned the vision for that product for at least 2.5 years. In fact, we had two people who would jockey. One of them thought it should be a great product for professional database developers, and another one thought it should be a great product for end users. And we didn't reconcile that for 2.5 years. Finally, we had somebody, Adam Bosworth came, and he provided a clear vision for the product. We got aligned, we focused on it. But then the next thing was, he was a visionary, and he couldn't stop adding to the product. Luckily, he was self-aware, and he realized that his skill set was not going to converge on a product. And he let us, we actually banned him from the developer hallway for the last 8 months of that product cycle. And we wound up building, so at the end of all that, after so many bad decisions and a lot of kind of wacky management, we had a product that was a hit. Now, what else happened? Well, we were launching into a product space that was like $600 products. And one of the things back in the day, Microsoft was always basically was revolutionizing software, among other ways, by making it more accessible from price. And our marketing lead decided that we would do a $99 for 99 days. And it sounded like so chintzy, like late night TV advertisement, like buy steak knives, $99 for 99 days. But it wound up actually getting a lot of people to pay attention to something that was brand new. It was the first kind of drag and drop, easy to build database applications based on this new graphic interface, and it was a total hit. The interesting thing about that story is it's easy to say I worked on Access One and it wound up being very successful. But I really think that I learned way more life lessons by all the things that we did that didn't work out. In hindsight, were really kind of dumb. Among other things, at the beginning, we would just say, okay, I think that'll take me about 20 hours to write that feature. So we would basically schedule ourselves to do 40 hours of feature work every week, and then assume that the product would all come together and be high quality. And what you wound up having is people jamming in a lot of code, and then these unending debugging, quarter after quarter of getting the code to actually work. And being in this industry and just seeing how the science and the art of making software that's reliable and robust has just changed so dramatically. But key takeaway is if you're on a project and things are not going the way you want, it is a learning opportunity. Take advantage of it. When I left Microsoft, as I said, and put on backpacks, and we traveled around. And while I was gone, my manager, they had their first child, and he decided to leave Microsoft. And so they recruited me for that role. So I'd been a dev, I got to be a dev manager. But then I was still traveling, so it was going to be 3 months before I started, and there was a reorg. So when I came back, I was offered a role, smaller team, but developers, testers, and program managers. And I remember thinking, like, I'm not qualified for that. I've never been a tester. How could I manage testers? I've never been a program manager. Now, I've worked with them. I know what a good one looks like. But I said, yeah, I'll do that. Sure, I'd love to do that. And that's another thing that I would say is almost everything I've been able to do because I said yes when I had an opportunity that, frankly, I was not qualified for. I did not have what people would think of as the prerequisites. But if somebody's willing to bet on you because of whatever you've done in another role, go for it. And then leverage like crazy the expertise you have around you. I was working on Access. I didn't take database. The database class here back then was really, really, really hard. I was already doing the computer graphics class. I didn't do the database class. So I get there, I get put on a database product. I don't know anything. But we had a great database expert, and I just was the guy that asked him the naive questions and harassed him. And eventually he came to like the fact that this young kid really wanted to know about databases. And I'd say you will always be able to find experts. Don't let your expertise get in your way. If you've already kind of got the confidence that you can learn things quickly, definitely go for it. Also, actually, very much speaking to Dora's talk, is what is right for you is going to be different from what's right to the person next to you. And so pay attention to that. I was somebody who didn't really ever focus on what do I want to be doing 5 years from now or 4 years from now. I had about a 2-year window that I ever really thought about. And I always started thinking, God, I like my job. I can't imagine being having my boss's job. That seems boring. You're not really involved in delivery as much. And then over the course of the next 2 years, I'd say, God, you can actually get a lot more done there. You've got access to all these folks that you can help guide, and you can solve problems at a different level. And so my experience was kind of that way. But part of that was because I've discovered early on I like managing people. Whatever you do, don't go into a management track if you don't get excitement and enjoyment out of finding that thing that will help somebody be a much better employee. There are companies, Microsoft, for instance, had a parallel track, still has a parallel track, where you could just grow in your career as much if you didn't manage people as if you did. In fact, there are fewer technical fellows than there are corporate VPs at Microsoft. And even at the Gates Foundation, we wrestle with that. It's how to make sure that the people who are great at what they do don't get pushed into management tracks. I'm a generalist. My dad was an ultimate specialist. Lots of other people tend more to kind of the mastery of being expert at one thing. Just know yourself and pick your paths appropriately. Now, one of the amazing things, I'm not going to dive into it, but certainly if you have questions, I got to live through a lot of transitions in software. So when I started, I worked on a DOS app, Microsoft Works. And then I was working on this database product in this brand new graphical user interface, which was Windows. And then right when we acquired Hotmail, actually, I moved over to the new world of online services and got to manage Hotmail, Messenger, like the biggest services in the world. Hotmail was the first service that had to deal with petabytes of user data, for example. And we were, God, all these things that we were trying to figure out for the first time. And then I got to move to mobile services. So because I knew that I loved being a V1 guy, I never went to the Office team or the Windows team. I went kind of more on what was next. Other ones of my friends kind of hated that chaos, and they loved the mastery of being the Windows kernel expert, for example. And then I got more and more interested in business and business strategy. And in with my mobile role, I actually got a chance to build a business. Wound up being like a $100 million business, which anywhere else would have been a huge business. At Microsoft, it actually was irrelevant. So that wasn't the big part of it, but understanding the business strategy was very exciting to me. And in fact, one of the reasons I left Microsoft was that the VPs there were kind of more and more, well, are you a business VP or are you a tech VP? I think that has changed, actually, and it's a little bit more generalist now under Satya than it had been. But it's fascinating to see strategies and things that you're trying to do but you can't get done we were trying to do a lot of things in mobile, not my brethren that were running the mobile Windows Phone and Windows Mobile before that, just as RIM was. There were all these things that we were trying to get done in that industry that we were unable to get done because the mobile operators had all the control. And it took actually Steve Jobs and his kind of charisma and his star quality to get one operator to change the way that the device would expose features on their network. That was AT&T. A chink in the armor of the operators, and that changed everything. So very fun to be in the middle of the action when crazy things are happening. And any of you who have experiences with RIM, RIM and Microsoft both completely lost out in a massive software transition here. So I said, I finally, time had come for me to actually move on, and I didn't really know what I wanted to do next. And so I talked to a bunch of people, and they just said, talk to a bunch of people. So other speakers today have told you about the importance of networking. It's important to do now while you're here. So I think your faculty here are very interesting avenues for your networking. The other students here are very interesting. You want to be the person that your brilliant colleague, student, taps when they have the great, the next startup, and they want to bring some talent on board. So network now, but network always. One of the things that I didn't do a good job of at Microsoft was I networked within the company. I had almost no network outside the company. I sat in a classroom and I realized that wasn't for me the way I wanted to find my next gig. And I got involved in angel investing, and I found that if you actually have entrepreneurs who are coming and pitching their newest ideas, wow, what a fun way to learn. And if they think that you might write them a check for $10,000, they'll answer any question that you have for them if you're with a bunch of other people who might be able to write checks and aggregate enough money to make it worth their while. So I found that for me, angel investing was a fantastic avenue to learn a whole new space. It was also a time when I realized that, I'm in a new space, I'm trying to think of the right questions to ask. I'm with a bunch of other people on the due diligence team. And just the diversity, they all came from different backgrounds. At Microsoft, there was, there was more similarity of background. In this group, people would ask questions that I would never think of. And I'd go, wow, like, I really, really, really am happy that person is next to me, helping us figure this out. And so the idea of kind of diverse viewpoints, building a better team. I could speak at length of this. I just want to toss it up there. Very few companies that I've followed through this period of my life have failed because their product or their tech didn't work. They've failed because they couldn't find ways into market, or they ran out of money, or their product was 20% better, but to actually make a difference in that sector, it needed to be to make their customers' lives 80% better, 100% better. I told you that things happen in weird ways. I almost, instead of computer science, I almost went into what was environmental engineering, I think even back then, or environmental studies, because I cared a lot about water when I was at Waterloo. When I traveled around, I was looking at issues of water. When I left Microsoft, I got on the board of a local NGO on water. And then lo and behold, somebody at the Gates Foundation found out that I was on this board, and they called me up. Is there anybody that you might know that might be interested and qualified for this Director of Water and Sanitation at the Gates Foundation? After about 5 minutes on the phone, I'm like, well, I'm not qualified, but I would love to do this job. Give me a chance. And that's kind of the crazy way that I got this current job. And interestingly enough, because I'd spent all that time, it was very clear my passion for improving things in the developed world, because every one of my vacations for the last 20 years had pretty much been in the developing world. And so it's interesting. You never really know kind of what path the future will take. But if you follow the things you're interested in, opportunity opens up. So now I'm lucky I've got this kind of unique platform. Obviously there's the funding, but there's also the ability to kind of convene remarkable talent. I joined a team that's focused on sanitation. I didn't need to be a sanitation expert because of my team of like 10 or 11 program officers. I've got 4 world-class sanitation experts. So they're the ones that can help guide me. But 4.5 years later, now I am a sanitation expert, and can be adding value in my own way. Here's where I'm going to dive into kind of a little micro lecture. Like, why is it that this is even an interesting space? If you're in Waterloo, sanitation's not a problem. urban sanitation in developing countries is critical and is in need of innovation. And that's why Bill and Melinda decided this was going to be one of the areas that they focused on. And interestingly, they want to focus their money from the foundation side on places where there are market failures, where people who are seeking profit and with startup companies aren't likely to go because it's just too hard to slog. They don't see the profit upside. And this is a great example where you've got a technology that works really well for the developed world, but frankly is not working at all in developing countries. So you can go to developing countries, to cities, and see wastewater treatment plants where they borrowed $100 million, got them running, but these infrastructures cost a lot of money, a lot of water, a lot of power to keep running, and that's what most of these cities don't have. So the new kind of space that I'm involved in innovating around is sanitation. So a couple slides to give you a sense of this. Obviously, there's the world that we're mostly familiar with, but I grew up with actually a septic tank, and a totally good system. Trucks came and emptied it, and it got treated, and nobody got ill. There's a lot of innovation that happens here, but it's expensive, and nobody was really figuring out, could you radically innovate this alternate approach? Which is important because there's already 2.7 billion people that aren't connected, that have a pit latrine or a septic tank that needs emptying. And if you think about the future and water shortages, especially in the context of climate change, a huge part of the world's population is going to be in an area where the water stresses are going to be tremendous. So the concept that we're going to use water, gather like tons of managed water to flush around our waste, diluting it tremendously, but not enough so that it's not still toxic to humans, seems like a super bad system design. So how do we change this? So one of the problems, too, is the way we measured it. If you've ever heard of the Millennium Development Goals, they talked about reducing by half the number of people in the world that didn't have access to a toilet. But the problem is that people don't get sick just whether or not they have a toilet. They get sick if they come into contact with other people's waste. So we were managing and measuring the wrong things. And to give you an example, this is a snapshot of Dhaka, huge city, capital Bangladesh, 14 million people and growing. And if you look at, so 20% of people in this city use a toilet that's connected to a sewer line. 79% use one that's connected to a septic tank or to a tank. Only 1% aren't using a toilet. So from the MDG perspective, that's like 99% awesome. Except if you've ever walked around Dhaka, you know that from a sanitation standpoint, it's kind of a nightmare. And here's the reason. Basically, most of those tanks just have an overflow pipe that goes right into the drains in the street, which are open. So kids play, a ball falls into the drain, animals. So basically, it's as if everybody's not using a toilet. They have the privacy of a toilet, but they don't have the public health benefits of it. And there's no system to actually safely empty these things. And so the astounding, this is data we had in 2012. This was presented by the World Bank's Water and Sanitation Program. The amazing bottom line is that only 2% of the human waste from this massive city that's growing every day is getting managed, is getting treated. So all the other pathogens are basically getting people sick and killing people. And in fact, it's not just death and disease. India, the World Bank thinks that India's GDP is 5% lower, so lower by $100 billion than it could be if they solved their sanitation problem. So it's a huge economic drag. One of the things that we were involved with, as in 2015 they redefined the Millennium Development Goals to become the Sustainable Development Goals. By 2030, we set these new goals. And now success means that you're treating the waste. So we now are starting to get the baseline data, and everybody in the world is saying we want to do this. But the reality is, I asked my sanitation experts in my first week, what is the city in sub-Saharan Africa that's solved this, that we could leverage and use as a success story? Crickets. How about South Asia? What's the city that's really figured it out? Silence. So we're starting from scratch in trying to figure out that it's possible to do this without sewers. And that's what leads to kind of technology innovation. So this was January 2013, really ironic. I wound up joining the foundation 5 months later. Will we ever invent anything this useful again? In the UK, they did a survey of all their scientists. What's the most important innovation ever for public health? And I think antibiotics was number 2, and number 1 was modern sanitation. So now we asked ourselves, apparently Bill and one of his top technical advisors asked themselves, could you, what we deposit in a toilet actually has some energy in it. Could you take that energy to drive some process that would kill all the germs, all the pathogens that make people sick? And could you do that in a way that, and it didn't smell, and you wouldn't need water coming in, and you wouldn't need a sewer line coming out, and you do it all for 5 cents per user per day, all in. And that became the Reinvent the Toilet Challenge. And it was, apparently when it happened before my time, went out to a bunch of universities, see, does anybody want to engage on this? Does anybody have any ideas? And most people thought it was crazy and that Bill and Melinda were just going to be, and Warren were going to be wasting all their money. What's exciting is we now have funded, by the end of next quarter, we'll have 7 different designs in the field being tested, including one by your arch rival, University of Toronto. So how? And so it's actually shifted from this crazy moonshot idea where it was unlikely that we would ever find a way to do it to now, wow, we've got 7 candidates. It's kind of hard to believe that all of them are going to fail. I mean, there will be startup failures for sure still. And so this is what we mean. It can operate completely off the grid. You don't need to wait for the pipes to get to your house. You could just buy one of these. And cheap. The hardest thing is energy. We have a toilet. There's one that just went into the Discovery Center at the foundation. Basically, when you lift the lid, it's basically storing that energy in a spring. And after, I think it's like 25 lifts, that energy gets turned into mechanical energy that moves things along. Basically, it does liquid-solid separation. It drops things into a downdraft gasifier. The gasifier burns the feces. That heat is used to pasteurize the urine. It uses a membrane. And what you actually have is pathogen-free sterile water that can be used for whatever you want. And this is in a household toilet. So it's still too big. We still don't know if the energy will all balance out, but it's at least kind of within possibility now. And at this point, these are the folks that are going to be in market either already or soon. Just give you a sense, Loughborough University, their approach, each of these has completely different design. Their approach, it's like a pressure cooker. You raise the temperature and the pressure. It causes hydrothermal carbonization, so basically burning even in the liquid. That's exothermic. It generates more energy than you put in. And so the whole thing there is, can you capture enough of that heat, turn it into stored energy in a battery so that you can fuel the next cycle? And if you could, that toilet could work completely off the grid, standalone, no need for a solar panel or any other kind of energy introduced to the system. But that all is going to come down to the engineering around how efficient can we make that energy system. Coming to the end, here's where we're at. We've got prototypes developed. I actively, one of the great things about working at the Gates Foundation is I can get a meeting with a senior person at any arbitrary company, partly because Bill and Melinda Gates are celebrities, and I get to ride on that. So the University of Toronto might not be able to get a meeting, but I can. So one of the things I'm doing now is trying to pair up the people who might take this intellectual property and take it to market and build toilets for the world with our grantees that have that intellectual property. And this is the money slide that I like to present to companies, which is saying, listen, the places where sanitation has not been solved just happen to be the fastest growing economies in the world. So we believe we've got a model, quite a rich model now, and with some assumptions, this is a $2 billion a year kind of greenfield opportunity. With different inputs, it's an $8 billion a year greenfield opportunity by 2030. So we're not saying we want companies to go into charitable businesses. We're saying we think there's a huge business opportunity here. We've spent probably now couple $100 million on really early stage R&D. You now have the opportunity to be first to market in this new space. So I'm hoping that instead of, this is the curve for auto ownership, this is the curve of internet adoption, what would it take for us to not only get these Reinvented toilets to market, but to accelerate the adoption of them as fast as we can? An example of something we've done that's kind of wacky, you guys have probably all heard of ISO standards, ISO blah, blah, blah. There's now an ISO 30500 for the Reinvented toilet. And so that it's not going to be something that the Gates Foundation judges doesn't make it or not. There's now very clear criteria. And it's the first time that there's ever been an ISO standard. It's in draft form. It's not finalized yet. It's the first time they've ever even started to do a standard before there's been a product in the market. And that's because we realized that if we could have a standard there that defines what success looks like, we could accelerate this curve. So my last slide, so final recommendations. There's been a lot of talk about how should you think about where you want to go. And I'd say you guys will all have a number of different phase shifts in your life. And I like to think about organizations, whether it's for-profit, not-for-profit, a role in the public sector. Think of them as platforms for what you want to do. If what you want to do is basically get a lot of different opportunity, maybe go for a company that looks like it's high growth. Doesn't matter whether they're starting from very low or medium. If they're high growth, there are going to be opportunities. Other folks, Patrick has talked about kind of the small company versus big company. I think in your co-op program, test it out. Go to both of them, get a feel for what fits you. And like I said, coming out of Waterloo, wow, you guys are among a handful of universities that really, if a couple people coming out of a college say, hey, we've got an idea and we'd like some funding, Waterloo people get actually paid attention to and taken seriously, like Stanford, like MIT. That's a short list. And so you guys can take advantage of things that a lot of other students cannot do, including a lot of programs here that supported that never were around when I was here. I have learned a lot about diversity. On my team at the foundation, the program officers, one comes from Bangladesh, one comes from Zambia, one comes from Ivory Coast, one comes from Romania, one comes from Dubai, one comes from the Netherlands, one comes from Scotland. I think I've got 2 Americans, and I'm the only Canadian on the team. Insanely diverse from that perspective. And what it means is that they ask questions that I wouldn't think of, and so we get to better answers. It also means it's harder for me to manage, because those cultures are very different. But to me, it's totally worth it. Like figuring out how to kind of manage people with different expectations in order to get the output that you get from this level of diversity, I think is very important. So some of you are going to be like Patrick, and you're going to be in roles where you're hiring teams. And think a lot about how you complement what you bring and what your team currently brings, because it's so easy to try to hire the person that makes you feel like they're really smart because they're kind of like you. Really focus on diversity. And then finally, don't worry if it feels like you're not qualified. If somebody's giving you an opportunity to learn something new and take a chance, go for it. Last, I think I'm a father. I think the most important things in my children are, can I basically encourage them to stay curious, empathetic, and be confident, like take those leaps. And so think about that for yourself. What are the things that you can do in your job, in your interactions to basically invest in your own curiosity, your ability to see things through other people's eyes, and then basically fake it till you make it. It really is a very valuable thing to be able to do. All right, thank you.
I have to admit, like, we met for breakfast this morning. I was never that excited about sanitation, to be honest. Listening to Brian and his passion and the work that they're doing, it was really interesting and got me thinking a lot. I travel like you in a lot of third world countries and thinking about the solutions and the problems they're facing. We do have a little bit of time. Questions? I see one already, so please.
I'm wondering, like, was it the case of market failure with the water system of that, like, third world country of Flint, Michigan?
Yeah, so the interesting thing is that everybody assumes that every country's path to solve the sanitation problem, everybody recognizes it's a problem. There's not been a single society that really gets to middle income level without solving sanitation. And they've all figured out how to basically be able to pay for sewer systems and wastewater treatment plants and all the water and all the energy. But in these, if you see China's doing that right now, but that's because they say, okay, let's move the people out of here, let's build a city, let's put in all the infrastructure and let's invite the people back. No other country is evolving like that in South Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa. People are pouring in every day and they're going to the slums, the less developed areas. And it's incredibly hard to imagine ever replumbing those areas. And it's also kind of a bad system. Like the idea that we basically spend all this money and energy to pump water into our homes that we then use to flush. Basically, if you took all your feces for a year and you dried it out, it would fit in a backpack. So you've got a small amount of pathogenic, toxic stuff, right? Most diseases that kill people are transmitted from that stuff. And you're putting in like 100,000 liters of water and it's still toxic. It's just a bad design. So what we're trying to do is come up with an alternative gold standard for sanitation.
So why don't you use say enzymes, like biological agents or chemical agents to do that instead of having pumping energy?
Got it. Great question. Because it turns out that there are a couple of pathogens that are super, super hardy, and we've not found any biological approach to solve them. One of them is intestinal worms. The eggs of intestinal worms, awful thing to talk about. Be very happy I didn't show you any pictures. They can live in a compost pile for like 6 years and then still be viable. And so that's actually in the standard. The standard says you've got to be able to kill helminthids. Cryptosporidia is another pathogen that's super hardy. And then the other thing is that if the system design is something where the household has to buy something to add in, we do not believe it will succeed. We think that's just too much of a failure point. Yeah.
Like you're saying, there's a ton of water waste that goes into the system that we're using here. Mm-hmm. And obviously, there are places where it's a priority to get very efficient systems, like mentioned, in place. But I mean, in the long run, would there be the possibility of kind of implementing those systems in places here where we have enough water and we have the infrastructure, but it's still extremely wasteful, and eventually, it's important to kind of not be wasteful with water and other resources like that? Yeah,
absolutely. I'm hoping that this might be the first technology that actually makes it to scale, like tens of millions of units in the developing world, and then comes back and dramatically impacts the developed world. So that's not kind of my charter, but it's something that everybody that's considering commercializing this is thinking about, for sure.
So looking forward, let's say 30, 50, 65 years, where you have solved the sanitation problem and these toilets are in existence in these third world countries, where there's all this pollution of their waterways. Do you see the waters becoming cleaner then because you're not constantly reintroducing pathogens? Is the second tier of this project going to be, okay, we've solved the sanitation issue, now how do we clean the waters that have been polluted? How does that happen?
Yeah, it's interesting. So my team is a water and sanitation and hygiene team, but we focus completely on sanitation and on urban sanitation because we think that there are a lot of other organizations and actually for-profit companies that are doing really innovative things in water purification but the biggest problem is people haven't really been innovating in the same ways in sanitation to stop the problem more upstream. So if you think of in India, there's the Ganges, and the Ganges is like the holy Ganges, and people go pilgrimages to bathe in the holy Ganges. The Ganges is a cesspool. None of you would want to put your body in the Ganges because all of the towns upstream are dumping all of their waste into the Ganges. So the Ganges, if my team is successful and our extended team, all of our partners are successful, 15 years from now, 20 years from now, the Ganges should be a much, 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 much cleaner river. And then you can start to go after all the other problems. But one other example that most of these cities, when they dig the trench and you've got a water line going to the home and you've got the sewer line going from the home, and they leak, pipes leak, and if you're not doing all the preventive maintenance that we may be able to afford here, they're more likely to leak. And then in all these cities, you might have pipe water, but it's rare for you to have it 7x24, right? So it means that those pressurized pipes will lose pressure. What happens when they lose pressure? And so you have the sewage pipes that are leaking right next to the water pipes to the home that are, and so that's why you can have a great water treatment system that's putting in wonderful water into the pipes, but by the time it gets to your home in Dhaka, Bangladesh, you can't drink it. So we think that if you solve the sanitation problem, the water problems, they're not solved, but they get way easier.
Talk about how you kind of use the people around you to solve technical problems that maybe you know little about. But when maybe not so much a problem now that now you know a lot about it, but at the beginning, how do you come up with kind of the problems you're going to solve? You know, like you mentioned looking at the Millennium Development Goals.
Right.
Do you look at kind of outside institutions, or do you also kind of ask the experts?
Yeah. What's interesting is even though it's a large organization, it's a family foundation. So we wind up investing in the things that Bill and Melinda care about, that for whatever reason they have been convinced this is a problem. And it's a problem where the Gates Foundation might be able to uniquely address it, where we might be able to catalyze something that wouldn't otherwise happen. Mostly because Bill and Melinda and Warren Buffett, the other funder, say, hey, listen, our capital can be as patient as anybody's. We can take bigger risks than the Canadian Aid Agency or the US Aid Agency or any of the other donors could take. So nobody else that we know would have funded kind of a Reinvent the Toilet moonshot. So the first thing comes from them, and that's like, hey, sanitation is a huge problem. Define the problem and see if there's ways that we could catalyze a new approach. And then they hire maybe a couple people that are expert in that area to kind of hash that out, and that's what happened here. And then we say, actually we think that it's very risky, but we think this Reinvent the Toilet thing is a good idea. Then we hired more people, like a great physics chemistry guy who gets involved very upstream around the main idea. And then we got, the next person we hired was somebody who used to be working for a trucking company, and he would be the one that everybody would pitch new ideas to. And he would be the one that would figure out, is this actually gonna work in real life? And can we scale it economically? And then the last guy we hired as a full-time was somebody who had worked on standards. He had actually worked on airplane doors for 20 years. So talk about siloed. But he thought in terms of certification and standards, and he knew how to navigate the standards world, and he's been invaluable. This ISO standard would never be where it would. So we kind of we make progress, and we said, God, we really need that. And then we were able to hire, our next hire would be that person. Randall?
Go ahead.
Yeah, so basically, you're working now on the Reinvented toilets, but what in your area, like, what sort of other problems that on the horizon that need to be addressed for these developing nations?
Yeah, well, this in my mind is still far from being solved. So if there's anybody that really is looking for a tough problem, this is a good one. So let's see, there are a couple of other things. We believe there will be pits to be emptied and septic tanks to be emptied for decades, even if we're completely successful with the Reinvented Toilet. And so we have this idea, imagine if you could bring up a truck that doesn't just suck everything out, and then you have to drive to that waste treatment site way outside of town, because that's expensive for the household. And what drives the expense is how far you have to take it. So like imagine if you could come up with a truck that could go into a slum, that could empty it out, that could separate the liquids and solids on the truck using a small amount of energy, that could sterilize the liquids and then leave them behind. And then you'd only truck the dewatered solids. You could do 4 times as many pits for every truck roll to the treatment plant. You would dramatically change the economics of pit emptying. So that's a problem that we're working on that has been the hardest to crack. We don't even have a single, we now have one prototype that we're hopeful, but it doesn't operate fast enough, and our partners, the engineers, think that they can make it operate 10 times as fast. And it's actually, ironically, taking the Loughborough University technology, the pressure cooker concept, and expanding it and completely re-engineering it. So one thing that's been fascinating is just we bring these entrepreneurs together, these innovators together, and we try to make them feel like they're all collaborators as opposed to competitors for our money. And we've seen actually a lot of synergies across the designs that are really hopeful. And that's an example of a completely different space.
You get the last question.
Okay. Brian,
Yeah.
I think you've already talked a little bit about this, but I'm struck that giving advice to the next generation, you were an undergrad, doing engineering, math, computer science. You probably never dreamed you were going to be where you are, and yet I would think you're in your perfect job and you're a rock star at it. It's pretty amazing. But what's interesting about it is that technology has opened the doors and created social innovation. Most people don't even know what a foundation is, and yet maybe that's where they really want to work. And the last point is, the world's getting a little more closed, like even though we got bigger problems, we got to work together. innovative solutions, the drawbridges are coming up. So what advice do you have people going out for them to kind of make a difference? You know, it's one thing to work at McKinsey or an investment bank or whatever, but how can they make a difference in their career, and how can they get a path that's the equivalent of yours, say, 10 or 20 years down the line? What you do may be very different.
Right.
Just a little more pointed version of what you already said, I think.
Sure. I think it's very hard to imagine. There's not much opportunity to graduate from Waterloo into a role at the Gates Foundation. But for instance, I've got 3 people on my team that worked at Boston Consulting Group. So we're doing McKinsey-like jobs, and what they learn, in those jobs, they learn how to take kind of a blank sheet of paper, tough problem, and break it down into something that was soluble. And that winds up being incredibly valuable to have on your team. So I think, and then it's interesting. I managed a bunch of innovation at Microsoft, R&D teams for years and years. And then I saw early stage startup innovation in Cleantech, and I didn't really realize it, but those kinds of experiences wound up being valuable to me in this space. I brought that to this team that they didn't have. They had the sanitation expertise. So part of it is recognizing that whatever you learn in your current role, if you think about it expansively, could be really valuable for your next role. And if you're always thinking about what do I want my next role to be, I think there are ways to, in steps, go towards, like, what I was doing is I wasn't really working on save the world technology. I was working on change the world technology, and then I started in my spare time caring about how to things get better, more with a philanthropic or just, layperson reading perspective. But then I was able to, I made some money, and so I was able to be a philanthropist on that part. But then, lo and behold, later on, this focus on innovation winds up being helpful to, a global development problem. So I just say, think expansively about what you're working on, and pay attention to it, and then always think about what's the next skill that might be good for you to have.
Brian?
All right.
On behalf of all of us here at the faculty, I do have a small gift for you here. Just to say thank you and congratulations on becoming an Alumni Achievement Award recipient.